Hello and welcome to the sixth and sadly the final talk of the fall 2021 Sara Turnbull Visiting Designer Speaker Series, where this semester we've been talking to designers, artists, activists, researchers, all in the name of creating a broader, larger conversation about design here at Lehman College. My name, of course, is David Schwittick, Assistant Professor of Graphic Design and Digital Media here in the Arts Department at Lehman College. And today we're going to conclude our 6-week-long discussion now about the eye. This series of discussions about the eye has been in conjunction with the Eyes Have It exhibition at the Lehman College Art Gallery. So if you haven't physically been there to see it, I recommend that you go. And before we begin today and I introduce our final guest, I just wanted to thank the Sara Turnbull Foundation and Dee Dunn for their support. It's I have to say, like, being able to do this, like having interesting discussions with artists and designers all over the world, has been during a pandemic, has just been amazing. So thank you to the Turnbull Foundation. I also want to thank Bart Bland and Deborah Yazinski in the Lehman College Art Gallery for their instrumental help and assistance with pulling this whole thing together. And of course, the Eyes Have It exhibition, which they also put together. And I want to thank all the students who have come today and the last 6 weeks and provided some thoughtful input and some questions. I want to thank Professor Sean Chang for bringing his students to this class and incorporating it into his class. And lastly, I just want to thank everybody else who's come to share in this lecture series and provide some input. It's been really great. So without further ado, today we'll be speaking with Evan Roth. He's based in Berlin, and his practice visualizes and archives typically unseen aspects of rapidly changing communication technology through a range of media, from sculpture to websites, which we're going to look at a giant range today. His work addresses the personal and cultural effects surrounding these changes and the role of individual agency within the media landscape. Roth's work has been exhibited at the Tate, Whitechapel Gallery, Jeu de Paume, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, and the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. He's the co-founder of the Graffiti Research Lab and the Free Art and Technology, or FAT Lab. And his work is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, which is where I actually first saw one of the things we're going to talk about today. Evan, welcome. You have quite a resume, and I know you're going to show us like a whole range of stuff. So why don't we just get into it?
Great. Thanks everybody for joining. David, thanks so much for the invitation. I was really excited to do this, so thank you for setting that up. Yeah. I thought today, we talked earlier prior to this about maybe keeping this somewhat informal. Like I'm in my studio here. Maybe we keep this a little bit more like a studio visit than a lecture. So
great.
That being said, I'm happy for people to interrupt, ask questions, either verbally or through the Q&A panel, and we can sort of, I have things I was planning to talk about, but I'm happy to divert and talk about anything. So feel free to keep this somewhat informal. The stuff I had planned to sort of talk about loosely was, I thought I'd go through generally like chronologically through some of my work with this idea of the eye in mind, and also with this idea of networks in mind, which is what I'm sort of bringing through my work anyway. So with those two themes in mind, I thought if I go back pretty early, like I basically did architecture undergrad, had a former life sort of doing that, went to graduate school for media art. And that was also when I moved to New York. And between studying media art and living in New York for the first time, like my thesis ended up being about code that I was getting through school and graffiti that I was falling in love with from like basically commuting between Brooklyn and Manhattan for graduate school. And so my thesis was kind of combining those two things and looking at overlapping design practices, overlapping problem-solving techniques that like hacker communities, especially hacker communities that stemmed from the free software movement, had, that I saw in common with the graffiti writing community and street art community in New York, and vice versa. So that was kind of what my thesis was involved in. This is, I won't go into this in too much detail, but my thesis was called Graffiti Analysis. And amongst other things, it was like me writing code kind of for the first time in a more structured way, and then also meeting a lot of people and collaborating with a lot of people, with graffiti writers, with technologists around New York. And with that work, after I graduated, I applied to iBeam, which many of you might be familiar with in New York. It's kind of an art and technology nonprofit. I guess I can share. I'm not sharing the screen yet. Is that right? Let me share.
Yeah, no, I don't see a share screen, but actually while you're doing that, I just want to remind everybody to use the Q&A function at the very bottom of the screen. If you have questions while Evan's talking or while we're just talking, please feel free to answer or ask any questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. So take it away.
These are just some images from that work, from that graffiti analysis project, which went beyond my thesis. Like I basically finished that project and then kept doing some of that work, especially at iBeam. And at iBeam, I got introduced to another group of people, one of which was James Powderly, who became my co-creator, and sort of had just the two of us were doing this project that we called Graffiti Research Lab. And Graffiti Research Lab was really, especially looking back on it, maybe less of an art project, more of we really had this like design approach towards making work, which was we kind of fancied ourselves more like Q than James Bond, right? Like we weren't going to be the one doing the stuff. We were going to be the one making the tools for the people doing the stuff. And so in that sense, it was a little bit like a design practice, an activist-based design practice. And our clients were like mostly graffiti writers and activists. And so our idea was like, as technologies were getting cheaper and cheaper and into the hands of more and more people, what were the sort of unexplored affordances that some of these technologies had as they got cheaper and we could start doing things in public space with them. And we made a whole bunch of different projects, but it was all under that sort of idea of like, okay, LEDs are getting cheaper. What can we do with those? Lasers, digital projectors. And our collaborators and test group were like a lot of graffiti writers and street artists in New York who became long-term collaborators, long-term friends. And I guess I don't need to go too deep into the sort of Graffiti Research Lab days, but it was, especially as like coming right out of school and having 2 or 3 years, which I couldn't thank iBeam enough for. Like I got really lucky to get that fellowship and have those 2 years to just be head down making work. And this was kind of the project that came out of that. And the other great thing was like, it was almost more like a band mentality than a art group. Like it was just a lot of travel, meeting new people in different cities, working with a lot of graffiti writers all over the world. And it was kind of, I don't know, it was really, for me, it was just, it's a fun time to look back on so many stories. But I think one of the big takeaways that James and I had after doing this for like a year or two is like, we started noticing that the media attention we were getting was disproportionate to the work we were making. Meaning we were getting like more attention than we probably deserved. And we were trying to figure out why, like, why was that happening? And we had different theories. Like our main theory was like that we were sort of providing this narrative that you're in the future, right? Like at least when I was growing up, it was like flying cars and like graffiti writers with lasers, like that meant you'd achieved like Jetsons level living in the future. And so I think that the story of this project was like easy to report on. And so once we figured that out, we were like, okay, well, that's something we can harness. That's something that we can sort of exploit to tell different stories, right? And so we realized part of the way into this project that what we thought was a project that had to do with hacking software, hacking hardware, really became more of a social hacking project. And so towards the latter part of that series of works that we did, it was really more thinking about how can we engage with the media and sort of hack the media to allow activist groups especially to get coverage in ways that maybe they wouldn't get coverage, or at least elevate.
This is before like Twitter, this is before social media, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was before social media. It was like, I remember YouTube was like a big discussion point for us when that came out, because we were, our sort of equation for releasing work at the time was like, we would have some type of media that was just sort of entertaining in a way that people would watch it regardless of the politics. And so we were dealing with a lot of video, but we were also critical of Google, and that wasn't even Google back then, that was just YouTube, but we were critical of YouTube prior to Google. And
Right.
so anyway, yeah, it was a different web, but blogs were still a thing. So it was like,
Right.
there were people there was a way to sort of, I mean, even the word viral, I don't even know if it was being used back there. It was called contagious media back then.
Yeah.
It's like old person stories. But anyway, we recognized that like there was a little bit of loophole in how culture was disseminating narratives there, where like it hadn't been monetized. It meaning like eyeballs on the internet hadn't been monetized at that point the way they are now. And we kind of recognized that we had a very small window to sort of push ideas out there and get attention in ways that now, you know, you can get a degree in how to get that kind of attention. But at the time, it was, for us, it was exciting to be playing with that media when it was so fresh and so new. And so what we were trying to do with it was use that as a platform to like be speaking out against some of these issues. Anyway, so that was sort of the graffiti research lab era. I'm happy to go into more of that if anybody wants to talk about it later. But that one, I was going into that sort of as a way because I did want to get to the iWriter since it fits the theme of the speaker series. Yeah. Because iWriter had a lot of overlap with, it was essentially like Graffiti Research Lab, which was me and James sort of at the center, but then a lot of people around us, one of which was Theo Watson, who wrote the code for the laser tag, which was the project with the writing on the digital, the projection on the walls. He was involved in the iWriter. Chris Agru, who was a friend and graduate and collaborator of mine, she did a thesis project in eye tracking, so she joined this team. And then Zach Lieberman, which many of you probably know, he was also like around during that GRL days, those I-beam days. He was my thesis advisor. So basically, like, we had been doing that GRL work and met a ton of people through that work, and we'd run into this this guy in LA named Nick Ebling, and he knew this guy named Temp One, this graffiti writer named Temp One, who years before I'd met him had become paralyzed with ALS, like Lou Gehrig's disease, which is a degenerative disease that leaves you in a position where, like, cognitively 100% there, but physically the only movement, at least that he had, was his eyes. And this guy Mick was like he's like, you guys are doing this crazy stuff, like, can we make a team? What can we do? And so we formed this team, and we kind of had this idea that stemmed from some of those, from that free culture, free software scene that was really influential to me early on. And there was an idea in those circles that was like, when you're thinking of software projects especially, it's like, rather than trying to make this system that's going to be a universal tool that everybody could use, another approach is, they call it like scratching a personal itch. Like, just make it for yourself, make it small, and the audience might follow, right? I don't know if that's a truism for all work. I'm sure it's not, but that was the approach we took toward the iWriter. So rather than, we were like, okay, we're going to make something that's going to be just for Temp One. We're going to start there. We're going to make a system just for him. That's all we're going to focus on. And we had ideas that this would be, we knew it was going to be an open and free system. We were hoping people would pick it up, but we were going to say, let's start there. Actually, I'll just talk over the video, and then I'll have something more interesting visually to show here.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's where we are right now. Small suburb outside of the.
Okay, you can see that video there?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was kind of how the project sort of came to start. And so this is Temp here. We went out to LA, met with him. He was like the other member of the team. Like, Temp was like, he was the one that was like telling us like what was working, what wasn't working, what kind of things he wanted to do with the system. And the first thing that we were sort of surprised by when we got there is that he did have a digital system for reading the eyes, this device called MyToby, which was a popular one for doing eye tracking to speech. And we were like, oh, can we look at it? And we started looking at what the system was. And it was essentially like, when you open, it looks like this nice fancy medical assistive computing device. And when you open it up, it's like a really cheap PC with like 4 cheap webcams in it. And we were like, this system doesn't need to cost like $15,000. You know, that system is $200 or $300 worth of parts, right? And so part of what we're going to do is like try to make an example of eye tracking systems that could push the medical industry to like have a reason to lower their prices to something more reasonable. So we did it with just an off-the-shelf laptop, and we used these PlayStation cameras. There's definitely more eloquent ways of making a system like this, but basically we just took different pairs of glasses, strapped the webcam there. We had these 2 little LED lights to shine into the eyes so that the camera could get a nice place to track from. This is James Powderly here. That's Zach. There's Chris. And then we just started working. We started working with Tempt, seeing what would work, what wouldn't work. Once we got the tracking system down, then it was about making software to make graffiti with, which is what you can see here. Very tedious process, as you might imagine. You don't even necessarily have a click. Like to click, it was like a pause, you know? So it's like very time consuming. And so it was trying to talk with him about how it would work, like forming letters, rearranging those letters, making drop shadows, making drips, like all the things that he wanted to be part of this system. And then we left LA. We spent some more time working back and forth. And then once we had the system really to a place where it was getting more robust and was working better, we all came back to LA to meet with him again. And that's what I think the second part of this video will show in a second here. And this was like a really cool just night we had, where we basically set up in the hospital room with him. He had his screen with the software running on it and a digital projection of a live stream around LA so he could see the city. And then we had another team of us that were out in LA with a digital projector and a webcam streaming back to him. So he would be in his hospital bed here writing letters, like making tags, and then we'd be projecting them in different places. Then he could see it in the city in real time. So it's like he'd be writing something and then he'd get to see it projected. And so it was like really about like him writing graffiti, him getting that graffiti back out into the city. And it was just like, it's not a perfect project. Like, to be honest, if I'm critical of this project, I think it's like, it's very easy to make it sound too good to be true. And it didn't solve all of Temp's problems. It didn't solve all of anyone's problems. But like for a moment there, it was just this really beautiful thing to see him making art again, to have this experience, like collaborating with him, to be out in the city, to be with him in the hospital room and just like making work and like seeing him be an artist again. So like, at least in that one very small part of that project, it was like, yeah, it's one I won't forget for sure.
I think another thing that it does really elegantly, though, that didn't occur to me until today, and when you pointed out that he had something already, but it was woefully insufficient and it was completely extractive. Like it just was there to extract money from people, right? It was,
yeah,
you know, that's
and
such a, yeah, go on.
So I don't want to take too much credit because my role in the project, to be honest, was like, the code was primarily written by Zach, Theo, and Chris. And even amongst the team, none of us want to take too much credit because anyway, just to say that like one thing that did end up happening, not because of us, but maybe this played a small part in that, is that the cost of these systems came down dramatically in the 5 years after this project. And I'm definitely not saying that's only because of this project. It's probably because technologies in general are becoming cheaper. Sure. It speaks to the fact that like when we know how these systems work, you can't just wrap a cheap computer and webcams in a plastic case and tell people it costs $20,000 anymore. So it speaks more to the fact that like there's some kind of empowerment that comes with understanding how these systems work. And so that was exciting to see. Of course, other people did use the system too. We had people using it in India. We had a team there developing it, working with technologists and working with people with ALS. So it was a project that had a little bit of a life after us also, which was always nice to see when you're working in these sort of open collaborative models and like free software practices. Yeah. So that's iWriter. We're still kind of like, if I'm moving chronologically, this is still like, let's say we're up to 2012 now. So in my, I don't know, let's say 16, 17 year professional art practice, it's still kind of in the first third maybe. And I thought it might be interesting to like go from there to what I'm working on now, because it's in some ways looks really differently, but it looks really different. But I think there's connecting threads also, but I think the threads that seem like they might not connect have to do with sort of the shifting digital space that we're all a part of, because I don't know, the internet, let's say, or connected systems in general, they've changed so much from the moment that I like quit doing architecture and went into doing immediate art till now. And I mean, this is something we're all aware of, but it's something I dealt with a lot because I was there by choice. Like I decided to be an artist. I decided that place within the arts that I was going to sort of try to carve out had to do with thinking about networks and how connected systems have an effect on us, both as individuals, as a society. And so maybe I'll just go chronologically for a second. Like, I'm just kind of scrolling through my web pages, places to go to. Maybe a good one is like, well, okay, this is one that's up now, but this is a series I've been doing for quite a while now. This one's, you can still see my screen, right?
Yeah.
This is an installation. It's called Since You Were Born. And so the idea for this installation, I think this just came down actually. This was at the Red Brick Art Museum in Beijing. But the idea for this installation, I've done it, this is the third time I've done it, is I basically keep track of all my browsing data. Like, you know, when you're browsing the internet, especially when you're on a laptop, there's a temporary directory on your computer that's caching all those images. And so I basically I have a script that archives that folder. And so I have this huge database of basically every image that goes through my laptop. And so I've been doing these installations called Since You Were Born, where I take all of the data that I saw on my laptop from the moment of my daughter's birth until the entire space is filled. It's usually, depending on the size of the room and how big I choose to consider a pixel to be once it translates to physical space, it's usually somewhere in the range of like 4 to 6 months worth of browsing data. And so they become these sort of spaces that I think it functions, to me anyway, how I'm interested in it functioning is there's like a couple things that happen. There's this one was in Jacksonville, Florida, but there's this moment of sort of stepping into it and you're kind of overwhelmed with the amount of data, because we don't often really get a sense of, like, it's like talking about numbers that are in the millions and billions, right? It's hard to even have a visual or conceptual idea of what that even entails. Like, what does a number that big mean? And so you start to get, I hope, like a sense of what that scale is. And especially if you connect that to, you know, the sort of digital shadow that this pales in comparison to the digital shadow that Google has on us, right? This is just two browsers on one laptop. Like, even for me, it's not even my cell phone, it's not the tablet, it's not my wife's computer I might use sometimes. Like, so the other part of this, and maybe connecting it to that idea of eye and gaze and security, is like, it's also meant to have that feeling of like, okay, what would it feel like for, you know, it's easy to, when you step into this, to be like, oh man, I don't know if I'd want to share all my browsing data. And so then it's like, okay, what does that say about you? If, even though we all don't have rooms where we print it out, we definitely all have companies that have directories of similar data collections. And so it's meant to be this like starting point to think about those things. Also to think about, I sometimes frame these as portraits. Like, I call the series like Internet Cache Self-Portraits, even though it's not a traditional portrait. I like the idea also of like thinking about whether our browsing data is like a true or false representation of sort of who we are. Because funny things happen in these too. Like, I've had to sort of, I used to do this with other people where I'd ask for their browsing data and I'd make these sort of portraits of them based on it, but it was like too invasive of an ask to be like, hey, you know that invisible secret directory on your computer that stores everything you see, can I have that? Like, I had so many of those conversations even with friends that I was like, okay, I'll stop asking, it's too annoying of a question.
And yet, like, as you point out, there are massive tech companies that we freely give this and more, our location data, our self images, portraits of ourselves, literal portraits, like, we freely upload those every day, every hour, right, without anyone thinking it's weird. And yet, like, there's this weird dichotomy suddenly, and when we're asked person to person just divulge our internet residue, it's like it's a no-go. I mean, that's weird to me that we're stuck in those two worlds.
Back to that like very old conundrum that the free culture movement has been talking about for a long time, of like that relationship between like freedom and convenience, right? A lot of, I think, the direction of technology, you can sort of take back to that place and look at what kinds of things we're willing to trade for perceived convenience. And I say that being as guilty of it as everybody else. Even presenting through Zoom is part of that convenience, right? There's clearly, there's other alternatives to using Zoom that or Google Maps or any of these systems. Like I like to just sort of couch myself as guilty in this too, because even though I go through phases of struggling against some of these things, I also interact with them. But it's like it is that old convenience versus freedom issue, which, and maybe this is a good transition, because those issues are ones that I were increasingly on the forefront of my mind as I was making projects like this. Like, even though these installations are more recent, like this series goes back quite a bit. I think to 2014, I started doing that series. I was doing other series of work also, but a lot of them had to do with, if not with, yeah, like here's a different version of that one, but I was making other pieces out of internet browsing history. That series is called Silhouettes. Making net art pieces. Like, my practice was still very much like based in sort of exploring what this medium of the web was. And as things were getting more spied on, as the internet was getting more monetized, people were making serious money on the internet now. The NSA spying scandal, I know that feels like old news, but that dealt a heavy blow to me. Like, between those three things, like the NSA spying scandal, like the Facebook IPO, and then and understanding more about how all these spying practices, it was just the internet was becoming this place that I was like questioning my decision of making this thing that I was back in those graffiti research lab, iWriter days, when I was also much younger, but I think I was kind of optimistically maybe naive about where that was all heading. Like, the reason I wanted to get out of architecture and go into this new media space was because I had really high hopes for where the kind of empowerment that those systems could give to people that didn't traditionally have as much of a voice in society. Like, that to me was like, how could I be doing architecture when this might be on the cusp, you know? I remember being in school when I got my first login to a server, and like uploading content to a server and hitting refresh on a browser, and like, I really just couldn't believe it. I was like, you mean we can say anything we want to as many people as we can reach for free? Like, and back then, yeah, that was even undergrad for me, but I remember having this feeling of like, this can't last. Like, they're gonna take this away. Like, there's no, yep. And the good news is like, some of that still is true. Like, you can still rent a server, you still can write code and upload files to that server, but connecting to the convenience issue, like, my kids are, unless I force it, they're not going to be introduced to the internet that way. They're going to be introduced to the internet as a series of for-profit platforms that they can make accounts on and they can upload stuff to, right? So even though a system does still exist where you can make your own stuff and host your own stuff, like, because it's so massively inconvenient compared to the ease of, you know, one-click solutions that are being offered, it's going to be something that really has to be, I'm going to have to be very strict for them to be introduced to the web that way. And lots of shit is going on these days. I don't know if I might fail on that parenting moment. We'll see.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So with all that going on, like, and this connects to this project called Red Lines, which I want to talk about, because I was basically dealing with all that, and I was toying with the idea of like transitioning to a different path in the arts, or maybe looking away from the internet towards something. And I was like, okay, but before I step away from the internet, I wanted to do something not from a place of pessimism, not from a place that was all apocalyptic and doom and gloom, but was something that was trying to rekindle some of why I fell in love with the internet and what I still felt was powerful about it. And so I went down this path which ended up being like, I don't know, it's still kind of going on, but let's say it's a 5-year long project, which for me, I'm starting to work slower, not working less hard, but like intentionally slowing down some of my practices as a way to sort of combat some of the accelerationist tendencies that we get pushed through with social media. And so, number one, this was me slowing down. I wanted to work slower on a project over more time. I wanted to experiment with working in different ways. Like, a lot of the way Graffiti Research Lab was functioning was trying to keep pace with the culture of the internet. Like, if anything, trying to stay one step ahead, you know, like really trying to keep up. What did you do yesterday? What did you do yesterday? Like, if you haven't posted today, what have you done for me lately? You know, like really trying to like ride that wave, and also trying to talk to big audiences. And so Red Lines for me was like, I want to try to understand the internet in a different way. And I want to experiment with working with it in a different way. So I basically just did all the exact opposites. I was like, I'm going to work really slowly. I'm going to work in smaller circles. I'm going to think of my audience as being very small. Like, I was thinking a successful audience for this might just be 50 people that were using it on a daily basis. Like, that was in the beginning. I was thinking that could be success for this project. And so just to dive into this project for a second, actually, I would just go to the project website. The general idea was like, as a way to have a different perception of what the internet was, I was like, I wanted to think about it as something physical, not as the cloud, not as a series of companies in different locations, but I wanted to understand it as something physical that was based in the landscape. And so I started, the first trip I did was to Sweden. I had a small grant through a project, and I was able to go to Sweden, and I had friends I was staying with that lived near some of the places where the fiber optic cables came ashore. And then my idea was to go visit these locations, these sort of transitional landscapes where the internet fiber optic cables sort of come out of the sea and meet the land. And I wasn't the first to do this. Like, the books have been written about this. Like, it was practices that I've read about and that I was kind of recreating. But from the very beginning, I kind of, just in a very personal way, from I don't know, my own art making, like, just fell in love with this as a practice, like finding these locations around the globe, often sort of strange locations. Like, I would start just by going to the submarine cable map, which many of you might know. It's run by this agency called Telegeography, but this map is basically just a map showing where all these fiber optic cables exist within the world. And so I would spend time just looking at this map, and like, a cool thing about this map, like, is, or not a cool thing about the map, a cool thing about this geography of the network is that you wouldn't want to put, like, you don't want to necessarily bury a fiber optic cable in the busiest port, right? So I don't know, where's a good example? Like you wouldn't want to do it in Buenos Aires. You'd want to do it outside. You'd want to do it in Las Toninas. So you end up, when you go visit these locations, you end up having a reason to go to these places that you might not have a reason to go to. Like, I remember on this trip, like the Las Toninas, when I was on the Wikipedia page for this town, and it's like mostly dirt roads. Like, their claim to fame was like, they have like one very Catholic hedge maze. That was their big thing for the town. It's just like a kind of travel, whether for tourists or for research, that I probably wouldn't have had. And so I got to see all these places, and also being on my own. I don't have that many. Usually when I'm traveling, it's for work, and I'll be invited by somebody, and which is great, and I get to meet with people and interact, which I like. But this project was totally different. I remember that Las Toninas trip was like, people in the hotel were like, "Why are you here? It's the off season. Like, there's no reason to be here. Like, this is a summer town. What are you doing here in the winter?" And it was just like a cool way to like be on my own and see these locations. And so I would go, I'd usually spend about 10 days. So in this map, if you keep zooming in, it'll show you like the pieces that I made. I don't know why I started here, but I'll just show some of these. So I start with this map. I find where the fiber optic cables come ashore. I go there, I start just filming. Like, I have this rule set for where I'm going. It has to do with thinking about the network. It has to do with thinking about the network not as something separate from the landscape, but as something that's part of our contemporary landscape, right? And then filming in this infrared camera. And the idea of filming in the infrared is that, like, if you cut open a fiber optic cable, what's streaming through, what would be shining out of that fiber optic cable if we dug one up and cut into it, is infrared light. Like, that is kind of the medium of the internet in a certain way, like blinking at the speed of light, infrared light going through glass. And so I modified this camera to film within a similar visual spectrum. This 1550 nanometers is what the internet modulates at. And so the idea was to like be filming the landscape, and maybe to me, it wasn't important to actually see a cable or necessarily to see any evidence of the internet, although some of them do show that. But more was like looking at the world through this lens and thinking about landscape. Here's the maze, actually, that last time.
Oh, wow.
So that's part of the project. Then the other part of the project is like this video file, for example. If we're talking about the medium of the work, I call it network located video, meaning that it's video, but its location of where it's stored in the network is like integral to the piece, right? So this video file, this MP4 file, is sitting on a server in Argentina. And so part of the idea is that when I pull up this URL and I go to this page and I'm looking at this video, that activates a physical path between my computer, the visitor's screen, and that server in Argentina, and that pathway of light is now activated, right? And so even though visually the video would of course look exactly the same if it was just sitting on my hard drive, the fact that it's traveling from the location we're looking at through infrared light and we're seeing it in infrared light, to me, this is kind of like a performative part of the piece. And then the other way it works is, can you see the URL at the top here?
Yeah.
So each of these pieces, the URL is essentially the title of the work, and it's how to view it. They're net art pieces. But if you copy the URL and you paste it into
that's
Google
the
Maps,
latitude and longitude.
yeah, it's like a GPS coordinate. So it's like, I talk with my students about titles. I love titles. Like titles of work, I think, can be such an interesting way to tell not what it is, but like give some clue of like what it's supposed to mean. And so for me, the title being both an address in the network as a URL and also an address within the globe is meant to be this clue that what I'm trying to talk about is like a singular landscape viewed through these two sort of lenses. So here, if we type it in, we can go, oh yeah, this should be a good one. We should be able to go see the labyrinth. There you go. There's the labyrinth in Las Vegas.
Laberinto.
And so you can see it's here, and then the cable comes up right at the end of the street, like coming through here. So that's some of what that Red Lines project was about. Like, I was talking about how it was like for me, partly about slowing down also. And so part of the slowing down was me working on it longer. And since I got to work on it for like over the course of several years, also my thinking on it changed in certain ways that I found interesting. Like in the end, it was almost less about the network as something physical, and it got more interested in, I really just kind of geeked out on the history of landscape-based image making and how this connected to that, and was hopefully a part of that lineage rather than something totally different from it. And so more recent installations that I've been doing with it I'll work with museums that have collections of historic landscape paintings. Let me just find it, like, this was a good example. So this was in Lisbon. And so I worked with the museum there that had these Portuguese landscape paintings. And then all the ones that are on this in red here, the ones that I made, obviously, those are all shot around, these are all based in Portugal. So you get this pairing of both Portuguese landscapes viewed in this different way. And then I'd hang them so that the horizon lines would kind of connect and they'd overlap. So it's starting to feel kind of like, hopefully feeling like these singular views of landscape. And this maybe connects, how much more time do I have? 20? This connects to the last one I'll show, which is like, because I was taking my time with the work and like wasn't rushing it in the way that I felt this urgency to back when I was doing like the graffiti research lab work, for example, where I felt this urgency to keep pace with the web, is this was almost like retrograde, like I was slowing down, like the work itself is very slow. It's these like steady shots. But the thing that I sort of fell into at the end, which is now driving the work I'm making now, which I'm excited to show because it's actually not online anywhere yet, I haven't shown it, is landscape. Like one way I fell in love with it is there are these images that like, they often feel so innocent in a way, like, oh, it's just blue sky and green grass, right? You could hang it wherever. You could hang it in an office and no one's gonna bat an eye over the politics of it, right? But it's like you only have to dig below the surface a tiny bit on landscape-based imagery before you start. Like as soon as you're talking about land, you're talking about ownership, you're talking about nationalism, you're talking about the labor that goes into that land. It's like you don't have to dig very deep before you start getting to all these bigger issues. And it's why, like, if you go to the Wikipedia entry for like Romance period landscape, like it basically forwards you to fascism. It's like, oh, you might be interested in learning about fascism, right? And so it's like, to me, that's really fascinating because it's not a place you necessarily are looking it's the bias of these painters, either unintentionally or intentionally in many cases also, up until, let's say, the 70s, like we weren't really talking about that so much. This is a relatively new idea that contained within this gilded frame is something perhaps much bigger, potentially more sinister than just this green grass that's in this beautiful color sunlight, right?
Yeah.
And so this is what became super interesting to me. This idea of thinking about bias, about thinking about the bias of the maker being embedded in something that we're not expecting. And this will be the last thing, and then really we can make this more of a discussion. But I basically stumbled into maps and thinking about map making practices. And I'll just put a new link in there. And I don't know if there's people here who have a history in maps. You probably already know a lot of this, but since it was new to me, I'll share it here. Actually, maybe I already have this page up somewhere. Let's see. So these are what's called mapping projections. And so basically, like, cartographers, ever since people have been representing the 3D world on 2D planes, have run into this impossible problem, which is there is no perfect way of taking like a 3D data set like the globe and flattening that perfectly. Something's always going to get distorted, right? Either the scale is going to be out of proportion, or where the things line up, what's the center line. There's all these different things that there's no perfect right way to solve, which to me was news, because my introductions to maps was probably like a lot of people's. Like at elementary school, you have this thing on the wall. I never questioned it. I just was like, oh, that's the world. That's exactly what it looks like. Good. It's fact. It's rigid. It's a fixed system that I don't have to question. And then as I got like down this map rabbit hole, like come to find out that like even something that we take so for granted as even north facing up is just a total construct, right? Not based in science, not based in nature. And in fact, like there's different moments in history where this changes, but one of the reasons for the map being up is like in China, when the first compasses were being developed, they happened to pick south being the direction that the needle magnetized to, right? You've got to pick one or the other. They happened to pick south. So all their maps were south facing up originally. And there was an emperor who lived in the north who didn't want to be at the bottom of the map, who flipped the maps. So just to say that like ideology and power structures have been a part of map making going all the way back to what we consider to be up and down. And now when we look at something as simple as north being up on the map, there's repercussions for that. They've done studies about how people view the global north versus the global south. There's like this like bias baked into like uptown versus downtown, like this like idea of up being good and down being bad. And so it's a discussion point that's been coming up more recently. But for me, all this was interesting because I was interested in talking about bias and algorithms. And to me, map making, of course, it predates what we think of as algorithms, at least algorithms based in code, because many of these are thousands of years old. And so these mapping projections became that form. They became this interesting way to be talking about bias. I don't know how much more do you want to hear about maps? You got 5 minutes?
Well, no, I think you can keep going, because there's I had a book that I wanted to share about alternative mapping, and we actually somebody put in the comments here another book. So I think let's have like a little discussion about them. I happen to be very interested in mapping. I think maps are beautiful, but as you're pointing out, they're fraught with bias and of course a colonial history, right? They've all been made in the framework of commerce and colonialism and slavery. So it's in the patriarchy. So it's like and also corporate history is the very first corporations were the very first to use these things to for the purposes of extraction. So I find it fascinating. I could talk about this for the next couple of hours. So go for it. Yeah.
How about I'll keep going. I'm not monitoring the comments as much, so feel free to interrupt me when there's questions. I'll keep talking until I hear that.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
The other thing that I stumbled into that I thought was interesting in the research phase of this project was there was this Russian cartographer named Gedemin in the 50s who came up with this idea that because we don't even necessarily know what the continents look like flattened, but B, because the human brain is so designed to recognize the human face. Like we're just
Right.
hardwired to see the face more than we are the continents of North America or South America. So his idea was, okay, if we're talking about distortions and mapping projections, one approach can be remove the continents, replace it with the human face, and we can see how these distortions and the projections affect the face, right? And so I came across this, and like there was these like conflicting emotions in me, where like one was, I think that there is like a poetry in that, like in order to understand how we see the world, how we understand how the world is distorted, we need to see ourselves. Like I liked that as a premise. But then, of course, when I started looking deeper and how these things were used and where they show up in history, where they show up in contemporary use, it's always a man's head. I've yet to find any example that's not a man's head. And so again, I'm looking for this way to be talking about bias, and then these systems for understanding these distortions is another lens of bias that's baked into the system. So this, even though obvious is a negative and it's exactly what I wanted to talk about, it's became interesting for me as a way to talk about those things. Yeah, even the way it's written about, it's like man's head drawn on. So it's like another lens of bias. And so the first thing I did was, I was thinking, oh, maybe I can come up with a new set of these like GeoJSON files, these data coordinates that cartographers could use that are not men, but then that became, well, then who do I make? And so then rather than, actually, this may be a good connection back to GRL things, rather than making a database, I decided to make a tool. And so I made a software where people could make their own outlines. So I made my wife, right? My wife's profile, more than my own, is the one that I could see distortions in any little bit that happens. And so the idea is that this would be a tool for cartographers where they could make an outline to understand distortions of a profile that they have a familiarity with. I won't have time to show this, but it's part of a larger software that I'm going to be releasing hopefully within the next 6 months. And this software, I'll just talk over it for a second. I don't want to waste too much time with it. But it basically has this drop-down menu at the top that has 150 different mapping projections. You can filter, you can warp the geography with all these mapping projections, which you can see me kind of playing with the dials here.
Oh wow!
I have my wife's profile is on the front of it, so you have this profile that, excuse me, the human face. You can start to see how those are distorting.
It's beautiful.
I removed the bounding box of the page, this clipping thing, so you can. I'm sort of interesting to see how these algorithms exist if they were to start extending off the page. So that was sort of something I thought was interesting. And then the last thing, if I just skip forward, that it does, which I think might be the most interesting for people that end up using it, is you can drop any image into this window and it will warp that image in the same way that it's warping the geography. And so basically, I mean, this software I've had, it's been 1.5 years I've had it running. And again, going back to that personal itch idea, at the moment, the software is just for me so that I can be experimenting with these. Oh, I have it here, actually. I can just show it. I don't need the screen capture. This is the software running live, like, and there's something about like moving, like, you know, like, I don't know, it's almost like an instrument, right? Where like there's something about moving the sliders and feeling it move and feeling the pull of the pulls. And I'll show you my favorite one, Litro. Oh my God, Litro is my favorite projection. 1833. So basically I've been spending the last 2 years in this software, getting to know how it functions. I spend a lot of time making different imagery to warp. So like, just as a quick example, I can take in,
I do have a quick question from the audience while you're doing that. Can you connect for us the relationship between maps as creating models of reality, aka ways of depicting place, and maps as models for reality, ways of constructing a place? It seems as though there might be power that we don't analyze or perceive among engineers, for example, who are laying fiber optic submarine cables that then shape landscapes of power and access in new, powerful, and problematic ways.
Yeah, so if I understand it, like there's maps being constructed showing where these cables are, but then you have the same companies that are utilizing this, laying new cables, reorganizing those maps finding routes over the North Pole as they melt. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the maps are used now as tools to construct a digital reality, right? So it's like where these hubs are, where the submarine cables are, but also not just internet technology, but trade routes, right? Where they've always been used for trade routes, and that has determined colonial misadventures all over the world, right? Just
Yeah.
because of the way the maps are drawn.
Totally. I mean, okay, and to connect that back to the project, like the whole reason that other piece was called Red Lines, it was supposed to be called the All Red Line. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this. This is something I came across in the research phase for the Red Lines project, but the other
This is
idea of
interesting.
using
Yeah,
red as
yeah,
a color and
yeah.
using
I've seen this
maps
before.
is like the original. So the All Red Line, this is this, trying to find a good image of it here. It was the name given to the first telegraph network that circumnavigated the globe. And this was the British at the height of empire trying to make this military advantage where they would have a communication system that traversed the globe, landing only in imperially controlled territories, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was called the All Red Line. Wow. I've also heard it. There's a publication that they published at the time that also call it the Empire Girdle, which is like the girdle of the empire going around the world, which I think is like an amazing name to think of for the internet now. And so part of the other thing I didn't get into in the Red Lines project was meant to be talking about this history for our current network, right? Because our current network, a lot of the places that I was visiting, Cape Town, Land's End, Porthcurno in the UK, Sydney, a lot of the places that I ended up visiting on my trip because they were major hubs for the modern day fiber optic network are the exact same beaches that they were in on this map. Like in the UK, actually, like Porthcurno, which is in Cornwall. And if you go in the winter and you visit the beach that the fiber optic cables come up on, which is, if you want to stand on top of the most data flowing under feet globally, it's this one tiny little surfing beach. But in the winter, as the beach erodes, you actually see this cable coming up, disused, of course, but coming up out of the sand. And so you get this overlapping of history. And so, I don't know, maybe that's a good place to sort of lead into discussion or talking, but it's getting back to that idea that I was looking at with Red Lines, which is like, these are not systems devoid of power structures and paths. And histories. They're not black boxes. They're not clean systems. They're not blue sky and green grass. Like these biases and these ideologies, they're as baked into our network as they were to landscape paintings and that they are to maps. And then just to show the end of this one, like basically what I'm doing now, I'll skip the rest of this. I'm painting, which is new to me. I've spent my pandemic basically painting quietly in the studio, which is what's behind me now. You can maybe see it. Like the mask that you see here are basically exports from that software. So the software exports these vinyl that I get cut digitally. Those become painting masks, and then I'm making these paintings that are meant to deal with a lot of these things. There's little things embedded into the paintings that I don't have time to talk about now, but just to say that, like, another slow practice, like another, I spent a year making the software. I spent a year learning how to paint, at least how to paint this kind of imagery. And now it'll probably be another year before I finally exhibit it. So it's fun to be able to show here, because I tend to only show this work in sort of studio visit environments. Like I haven't shown them publicly yet. But this is, I guess that's a good representation of the arc I've been on for the last. That's
amazing. I like this idea of making the abstract more tangible, right? Like you're taking things that are abstract and making them physical, right? And taking things that are invisible and making them visible in some way. And like, that's really fascinating. I mean, in some ways that's what artists do. So it's like, in some ways it's like, any artist can say that, but you're doing it with this new, very abstract, very new media that we don't even really know what it looks like. And it doesn't really look like anything in some ways. So it's fascinating to see it crystallize in that way. Well, a couple other things that brings to mind is, I'm just going to put in the chat, there's this book from the University of Hawaii Press about history of mapping Siam and I'm also going to put another
great.
book that this reminds me of. This is from the University of California Press. It's called Nonstop Metropolis. You should definitely check this out. But there's just one
Right.
thing in here that this book's pretty cool. It's all alternative mapping, but there's one other thing I just want to like show, and
Thanks
that's
for the
in
links.
here.
Thanks for
Oh
both
yeah,
those
no,
links. By the way. I've got them pulled up. I'm going to look into them later.
this map is called City of Women, and it's
Uh-huh.
a map of the New York subway system, and it's sort of like riffing on the Massimo Vignelli, 70s era map that was still vestiges of which are still with us today, obviously. But every stop on here is named after a very famous, well-known, or perhaps undersung woman. So it kind of reimagines the whole city through women who made the city and made the culture throughout the last 200 300 years.
Oh, that's super cool.
It's very cool, but it like brings up this whole new idea of no, I don't want to sign up, of how maps can or have been used traditionally in very negative ways or nefarious ways, but how they can be reimagined to tell entirely new narratives. Like they're storytelling, right? They're storytelling, right? I mean, that's sort of what you're doing with your work.
But the reason I like them as an example, though, is I don't think, until we start thinking about it, we don't typically talk about maps as narratives, as storytelling devices. And so the reason the discussion, I'm really hoping that this new series, whether it's through the software or through the paintings, the way I'm hoping to drive that discussion is towards algorithmic bias, towards the biases that, it's not that we're not talking about them, people are starting to talk about them, but these same biases that existed in landscape painting, that exist in map making practices, of course, they exist in our social networks, in all the digital systems that we're touching on a daily basis. So one of the reasons I like basing that conversation in something like maps is if we can take this thing that for many of us grew up viewing as this like rigid fixed practices and change our thinking to understand that it is a narrative, that it has always been storytelling, we can then maybe sort of transition that conversation to understanding how our social networks are also storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been fascinating, Evan. Thank you so much I feel like we just touched up on a whole other topic that we could discuss for a few more hours, but we are out of time. Thank you, Evan, for meeting with us and for helping us close out the lecture series. And again, thank you to all the students who are here, all the people who are joining us and for taking part. And lastly, thanks to the Turnbull Foundation for sponsoring this whole lecture series. We really appreciate it. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we sign off, Evan?
No, thanks everybody for joining, and thanks again for the invitation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much. All right, goodbye, everybody. Have a great rest of the semester.
Bye.